Um, okay, this parsha. And I gotta say, having a little bit more space because our kids are ensconced in happy places elsewhere at summer camps gives Neshama and me the chance to talk Torah in the morning, which I gotta tell you, rabbinical school was great, and I sure love my books, but there's nothing like talking Torah with my wife and learning from her. So I'm going to share some Torah today, and all of it is from the conversation that Nisham and I had earlier this morning. It's Parashat Balak. And to remind all of us, because we should always assume that a member of the community might not have all of the background, or maybe wasn't here for the first part of the conversation. So it's always a balancing act, but the big gift of Torah is that you can start it again and again. And there's always something new that comes out. That's why we say hafoch ba v'afoch ba dechula ba. Turn it over and over again. Something new will come out. So Parshat Balak is the story of a king named Balak, who is not Israelite, and he's afraid of Bnei Israel. He's afraid of us, as we have left Egypt, but the Egypt we left behind was destroyed, and every people that comes to attack us as ancient Israelites ends up suffering because God is with us. And so Balak the king realizes that there's no military campaign that can stop us. And it's not that we're looking to destroy his kingdom, but he is scared of us. In the ancient world, if your tribe was okay, it probably meant that it was dominating other tribes. It's not the kind of world that we wish for our children. It's a perpetual war machine. And in that ancient world, Balak's fear makes sense, but his strategy does not. I'll tell you why. So in the Torah, and we're going to talk Torah level and then interpretive level, what we call Midrash. On the Torah level of the story, Balak the king sends a lot of money and advisors to hire a foreign prophet. So not from the kingdom of Balak and not Israelite. They send this money and this request to a prophet whose name is Bilam. Bilam is a prophet who's renowned, and the messengers from King Balak say, we know that whoever you curse is cursed, and whoever you bless is blessed. He had a reputation, and an earned reputation, because he had done this work before. Sort of a mercenary prophet might be the right way to describe him. The rabbis understand his name Bilam to be Bli Am, without a nation, a prophet for hire, no tribal community. So as he goes on his way, he doesn't go on his way easily. So he gets this offer from King Balak and says, I can't curse anyone that God doesn't curse. I can't do anything that God doesn't put in my mouth. And God, through a dream, says to Bilam, don't go. Then the messengers ask again. And he says, God, what should I do? And God says, you should go. It's a very, very weird series of events. And he eventually does go. And skipping through the miracle of the talking donkey that I focused on yesterday, and now getting to the point of our learning today. He eventually does meet with the king, says, I will only be able to do what God tells me to do. And then Bilam ascends a mountain overlooking the children of Israel. And he notices their tents, and he ends up saying the language that we use when we walk into synagogue. We say, Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, how beautiful are your tents. He sees how we're arranged. And I'll talk about that arrangement another day this week. It's its own beautiful conversation. What about Bnei Israel's arranged tents? We're worthy of that kind of praise. But here's what I wanted to point to. This is the real crux of the conversation that Nisham and I were having just earlier today. As he's overlooking the tents of Israel, as he's preparing with his own sacrifices to curse or to do whatever God will place in his mouth, and you and I know that it will end up being a blessing, how scared should we have been? How scared should we have been of what was going to happen? Norman's Leo, I'm so touched that you're in Nairobi, Kenya, sharing Torah with all of us today. Welcome, welcome. Um, how scared should we have been of Bilam? Because I remember learning in yeshiva that he was a fake, that he was a charlatan, a magician, a sorcerer. No one used the word prophet to describe Bilam, except actually in the Mishnah, they did describe him as a Navi. In the Torah, he's considered a Navi. How scared should we have been? God intervenes in the curse that would have been, and that's why it turns into a blessing. But that should tell you something. It takes God's interruption of the curse to keep us safe. Because King Balak realized he couldn't defeat us militarily. There was no diplomatic solution that he was willing to explore, but he couldn't have beat us militarily. And we see that because God is fighting on our side. The king knows that. So who does he hire? He would not have hired a fake. He hired someone who had access to the divine. And that should give us pause. How powerful it is to realize that in the Torah's understanding of the divine, Israelites are not the only ones with access to God. Bilam, according to the early rabbis, knew how to access the one moment where God would be angry enough to not be in constant protective posture for Bnei Israel. So Bilam was waiting for heaven to be aligned just right, which means he knew when heaven was aligned just right. How important it is for us to understand that the Torah takes Bilam's power seriously. So then why, when I was in yeshiva and Neshama too, why in so many Jewish learning settings is Bilam's power dismissed? There might be a number of reasons for this. One of them is because it's very scary to imagine someone who has power over us, equal access to God. It's very scary in a world where if one tribe is okay, the other tribe is not. Well, if that prophet has access to God, maybe we, barely freed, vulnerable former slaves, won't make it. We have to believe that we have a unique and protecting relationship with God. But there might be another layer worth our exploration, and I'm going to ask the question without really answering it today, but it's something for us to do our own soul searching around. Perhaps one of the other reasons that I learned originally that Bilam was a fake is because in that setting where I was doing the learning, no one could have imagined the validity of other religions. Only we have access to God. Everything else is a lie. Now, I don't feel that way, but I was taught that. And if it's true that everything else is a lie, we have nothing to fear from Bilam. And I understand where that posture comes from. It's really, really, it's understandable why scared people can't imagine alternative ways of life. But it's to our own sadness, detriment, and spiritual poverty to imagine that we are the only ones who can access God. God is much bigger than Judaism. God is much bigger than Christianity. God is much bigger than Islam. God can even enfold, well, does, all of existence. So why should I limit God to my understanding, my people's understanding? Yes, I see God through the texts and ideas of our tradition. But in my recent learning and work with non-Jewish clergy, I gotta tell you, I see other faces of God. One unity with a multiplicity of faces. And instead of being afraid of the authentic power that they wield, instead of being afraid of my sisters and brothers who are equal prophets. If any of us is a prophet, then all of us is a prophet. And if none of us are prophets, then we're all on equal footing too, doing our best to reach toward the divine and bring our fragile planet just 1 inch closer to heaven, maybe a millimeter closer to heaven. Sometimes it feels like nanometers are the closest we could possibly get. I understand the Torah's fear about a mercenary prophet who has access to the divine. But the layers of interpretation that tell me I had nothing to be afraid of in the first place are also dangerous for me to entertain because they do not lead me to read the Torah authentically. The Torah says there's power there, and my lived experience and my confidence as a spiritual human being who knows that God is bigger than my own faith tradition gives me the chance to let in the Torah of my friends who are imams, my friends who are pastors, my friends who are priests. Their truths don't deny mine, and my truth doesn't deny theirs. If only Bilam had been righteous, then he would have intended to bless in the first place. How gorgeous the world would be if whatever our faith origins are, we recognized the face of God in the face of the other instead of othering them. I understand that a position of fear can make it really hard to imagine that somebody else has power who isn't me. But that comes from a place of trauma and insecurity, and I don't judge us or others for having that trauma or insecurity. But if we could treat that trauma and insecurity and help everyone have a sense of confidence and belonging, oh, how blessed we would be. So I don't think I'm entering this with a neat question. I think I'm suggesting something pretty strongly. So maybe it works for you. Our neighbors can bless us, and we can bless our neighbors. And by neighbors, I don't just mean the person you're lucky enough to live next to, the person who's lucky enough to live next to you. But I also mean across borders. We're all neighbors, aren't we? And the central command of the Torah is to love your neighbor as you would love yourself. Well, I think the marching orders are right there. Take the time to love yourself. Do the work it takes to really find that self-love. That's not narcissism. That's seeing God within you. Because if you can do that, then you will be a whole lot more able to love your neighbor, because you'll see the abundance of love that you have inside of you, just waiting to be shared. There's no shortage. The Torah might not have understood that, but the Torah didn't deny that there was power elsewhere too. In our interpretive level, sometimes we forget that we're not alone as being connected to God and as potential sources of blessing. Let's make sure that everything we do channels the blessing forward. And maybe that will help us open our eyes to see where blessing awaits beyond. All right, friends. Eileen's sending you comfort and sending love all around everyone. Here we go. Bless you all, friends. See you tomorrow.